Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Take a moment to settle in, to let the day behind you finally fade. There's no rush. We have time. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? A quiet room where the evening has grown still? A corner of the world where you're ready to let go? Tonight we're going to explore a place that existed for nearly 800 years. A civilization that rose in the western edge of the Mediterranean and became one of the most remarkable cultures the world has known. Moorish Spain, or Al-Andalus as it was called, was a land where three faiths, Islam, Christianity and Judaism, lived side by side, not always in perfect harmony, but in a way that created extraordinary beauty, learning and art. We'll discover how this culture began, understand the daily reality of life there, and contemplate what it meant when three different ways of seeing the world occupied the same streets, the same markets, the same pursuit of knowledge. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a lesson in conflict or a tale of inevitable tragedy. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through centuries of human experience, taking our time with gardens and poetry, with philosophers and physicians, with the quiet moments of ordinary life as much as the grand sweep of history. By the end, I think you'll find a kind of peace in understanding how complex and beautiful human civilization can be when we allow it to be. If you enjoy these calm explorations into history's quieter corners, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for trusting these journeys into the past. So settle in now, let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take a slow breath, and let it out even more slowly. And let's begin our slow drift through the streets of medieval Spain, where the call to prayer mixed with church bells, where Arabic and Hebrew and Latin all echoed from the same stone walls. There's nowhere you need to be right now, nothing you need to do. Just listen, and let the story unfold like the slow turning of pages in an ancient manuscript. In the year 711, a man named Tariq ibn Ziyad stood on the northern coast of Africa and looked across the narrow strait towards Spain. The distance was small, perhaps 8 miles at the closest point, but what lay beyond that water was an entire world. Spain, at that moment, was the Visigothic kingdom, a Christian realm that had ruled the Iberian Peninsula for nearly 3 centuries. It was wealthy, divided by internal conflicts, and largely unaware that everything was about to change. Tariq was a Berber commander serving under the Umayyad governor of North Africa. The Berbers were the indigenous people of northwest Africa, and many had converted to Islam as the new faith spread westward from Arabia. Now they stood poised to carry that faith across water into Europe. The reasons for the crossing are debated still. Some sources suggest an invitation from one faction of Visigothic nobility against another. Others point to the natural expansion of an empire that had already conquered from Arabia to the Atlantic. Whatever the exact catalyst, the decision was made, ships were gathered, men were assembled, and in the spring of that year the crossing began. The place where they landed would later bear Tariq's name, Gibraltar, from Jabal Tariq, _0_. It's a massive limestone rock that guards the strait, visible for miles, impossible to miss. Imagine those ships approaching, the men aboard seeing the mountain rise from the sea, knowing they were leaving everything familiar behind. The Berber forces numbered perhaps 7,000 initially, a relatively small invasion force by the standards of history. But what followed demonstrated that numbers alone do not determine the outcome of such moments. There's a legend, probably untrue but telling nonetheless, that Tariq burned his ships after landing. Whether he actually did this or not, the symbolism captures something real about the moment. There would be no easy retreat. The men who crossed that strait were committed to what came next. They would either make a new home in this land, or they would die trying. That kind of commitment, that willingness to step into the unknown and close the door behind you, runs through this entire story. It's what people do when they believe in something larger than comfort or safety. The first battle came quickly, at a place called Guadalete. The Visigothic king, Roderick, gathered his forces and marched to meet the invaders. The battle lasted several days. The sources are unclear about exactly what happened, as they always are for events so distant in time, but the outcome was definitive. Roderick died, his army scattered. And suddenly, impossibly, the door to Spain stood open. Within weeks, Tariq's forces had taken the Visigothic capital of Toledo. The conquest of an entire kingdom had begun with a crossing of 8 miles of water and a single battle. And this brings us to something that will define everything that follows. The speed and relative ease of the conquest suggested that something was ready to change in Spain. That the old order was fragile in ways that perhaps only became clear when tested. What happened next unfolded with a speed that still seems startling. By 718, just 7 years after Tariq's crossing, Muslim forces controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula. An entire kingdom, one that had stood for centuries, had fallen in less than a decade. To understand how this happened, we need to set aside the dramatic narratives of conquest and look at the more complex reality underneath. The Visigothic kingdom was troubled before the Muslims arrived. The nobility was divided into factions, often at war with each other over succession and power. The Jewish population, substantial in Spanish cities, had faced increasing persecution from the Christian rulers, including forced conversions and expulsions. The common people were heavily taxed and had little reason to fight desperately for the existing order. When the Muslim forces arrived, they often found cities willing to negotiate surrender rather than face siege. The terms offered were remarkably consistent and, by the standards of the time, relatively generous. Cities that surrendered peacefully could keep their churches, practice their religion, maintain their property, and govern their own internal affairs. They would pay a tax, the jizya, required of non-Muslims under Islamic law, but this was often less burdensome than the taxes they'd paid to Visigothic lords. Jewish communities, in particular, often welcomed the Muslim forces as liberators from Christian persecution. In some cities, Jewish residents are said to have helped hold the gates while Muslim armies approached. This doesn't mean the conquest was bloodless, or that everyone welcomed it. There was resistance, particularly in the north, where Christian lords maintained control of mountainous regions that would never fully fall to Muslim rule. There were battles, sieges, the violence that attends any conquest. But the defining characteristic of these early years was not prolonged warfare, but relatively rapid transition from one political order to another. The success brought reinforcements from North Africa and the Middle East. What had begun as a Berber venture quickly became part of the larger Umayyad Caliphate that stretched from Spain to the borders of China. Damascus, the Umayyad capital, was now connected to the western edge of Europe. Armies and administrators, poets and theologians, merchants and craftsmen began flowing into Al-Andalus, as Muslim Spain was called. The name itself, Al-Andalus, may derive from Vandalusia, the land of the Vandals who had passed through centuries before, though the etymology is disputed. What matters is that this new land now had a new name and a new identity. By 720, the Muslim armies had crossed the Pyrenees and were raiding into what is now France. They reached as far as Tours before being turned back by Frankish forces under Charles Martel in 732. That battle, often portrayed in European history as saving Christianity, marked the approximate northern limit of Muslim expansion in Western Europe. Al-Andalus would be Spain and Portugal, but not France. The border was set, and now the real work would begin. Not conquest, but construction. Not fighting, but building. What emerged from this would be unlike anything else in medieval Europe, a culture that would shine for centuries before it fell. And this is where our story truly begins, not with armies and battles, but with what people built when the fighting finally stopped. In the year 716, just 5 years after Tariq's crossing, the Muslim governor of Al-Andalus moved his capital to Córdoba. The city sat on the Guadalquivir River in southern Spain, in a fertile valley surrounded by hills. It was already ancient, founded by the Romans centuries before. and it had been a Visigothic city of some importance. But what it would become under Muslim rule would eclipse anything that had come before. Picture Córdoba in those early decades of the 8th century. It was still mostly a Roman city and structure, with narrow streets and old buildings, a bridge across the river that Roman engineers had built, walls that had stood for hundreds of years. The new rulers began slowly at first, establishing mosques, building administrative buildings, creating the infrastructure of government. But the city's true transformation would wait for the arrival of one particular man, someone whose story is so remarkable that we must pause here and understand who he was. His name was Abd al-Rahman, and he arrived in Córdoba in 756. He was 26 years old, and he was running for his life. To understand why requires us to look eastward, toward Damascus and the heart of the Islamic world, where a revolution was unfolding that would reshape everything. The Umayyad Caliphate, which had ruled the Islamic world for nearly a century, and which had sent the armies that conquered Spain, was being overthrown. The Abbasid family, distant relatives with different ideas about governance and religion, led a rebellion that would succeed in 750. When the Abbasids took power, they hunted down every member of the Umayyad family they could find. In a massacre at a banquet near the Euphrates River, they killed scores of Umayyad princes. They wanted no rivals, no surviving claimants to the power they had seized. But Abd al-Rahman escaped. He was in his early 20s, a prince of the royal family, and he ran. For 6 years he moved across North Africa, always one step ahead of Abbasid assassins, making his way westward toward the one place the Abbasids didn't yet control, Spain. When he finally arrived in Al-Andalus, he had nothing but his name and his claim to Umayyad legitimacy. He was alone, exiled, the last of his line. What happened next demonstrates something important about the nature of power and legitimacy in this world. The various Muslim factions in Spain were divided, squabbling among themselves, lacking strong central authority. Abd al-Rahman arrived and, through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and the weight of his family name, managed within months to take control of Córdoba and declare himself emir, not caliph, not claiming universal authority, but ruler of Al-Andalus nonetheless. He would rule for 32 years, and under his guidance, Córdoba began its transformation from regional city to one of the great capitals of the medieval world. He brought order to the fractious Muslim factions. He defended the emirate against both Christian kingdoms to the north and Abbasid attempts to undermine him from the east. He encouraged learning, attracted scholars, patronized poets and musicians. He built gardens, remembering the landscapes of his childhood in Syria, trying to recreate something of what he'd lost. There's a poem attributed to him about a palm tree he planted in Córdoba, comparing himself to that tree, far from home, standing alone in a foreign land, yet somehow surviving and even flourishing. Whether he actually wrote it is uncertain, but it captures the melancholy and determination that marked his reign. He was building something new while mourning what had been destroyed, creating a future while honouring a past that could never be recovered, and this dual consciousness, this sense of building something magnificent while carrying the weight of loss and exile, would become part of the cultural DNA of Al-Andalus. It's there in the poetry, in the music, in the philosophy that would emerge in the centuries ahead. A culture created by people who were, in various ways, far from home, making something new from fragments of many different traditions. Let us stay a moment longer with Abd al-Rahman, because his story illuminates so much about what Al-Andalus would become. He was not born to be a ruler of Spain. He was born in Damascus, in the palace, a prince of the Umayyad family with every expectation of a life of privilege and power in the heart of the Islamic world. His mother was a Berber concubine named Ra, which means palm tree in Arabic. There's that image again, the palm tree far from its native soil. When the Abbasid revolution came, Abd al-Rahman was somewhere on the frontier, away from the capital. This absence saved his life. When news reached him that his family had been massacred, that the Abbasids were hunting survivors, he began his flight. The accounts of his escape have the quality of legend, but the basic outline seems clear. He crossed Syria, travelled through Palestine and Egypt, made his way along the North African coast through what is now Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. For 6 years he survived on the edges, gathering information, waiting for opportunity, enduring the constant fear that assassins would find him. In Morocco, he connected with his mother's Berber relatives, gaining some protection and support. And he watched Spain, learning about the political situation there, understanding that the Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus were fragmented and vulnerable, that the Abbasids had not yet extended their control that far west. When he finally crossed to Spain in 755, he landed near Almuñécar on the southern coast. He had perhaps a handful of supporters. What he did have was his name. He was the last Umayyad prince, the heir to a dynasty that, despite being overthrown in the east, still commanded respect and loyalty among those who remembered. And he had desperation, which sometimes focuses the mind more sharply than comfort ever could. Within a year, through a combination of persuasion and military action, he had taken Córdoba and established himself as Emir of Al-Andalus. The existing governor, Yusuf al-Fihri, fought him and lost. Abd al-Rahman showed mercy to those who submitted and ruthlessness to those who continued to resist. He was building a state, and that required demonstrating both the benefits of cooperation and the costs of opposition. For 32 years, until his death in 788, he ruled. He established a dynasty that would last for nearly 3 centuries. He created a stable government in a land that had known mostly chaos since the original conquest. He defended the emirate against external threats and internal rebellions, and he began the cultural flowering that would make Córdoba famous. But what kind of man was he? The sources give us glimpses. He was a patron of learning and the arts, collecting books and supporting scholars. He was a capable military commander who personally led campaigns. He was ruthless when challenged. He executed his own sons when they rebelled, a decision that haunts the historical record. He was a builder, most famously beginning the construction of the great Mosque of Córdoba, which would become one of the architectural wonders of the medieval world. He was also, it seems, often sad. He had survived when his entire family was murdered. He had lost his homeland forever. He lived always with the knowledge that the Abbasids, who controlled the East, considered him a fugitive and a pretender. He created a magnificent court in Córdoba, but it was a court in exile, a deliberate recreation of Umayyad glory in a land far from Damascus. This combination of brilliance and melancholy, of achievement shadowed by loss, set a tone that would echo through the centuries of Al-Andalus. It was a culture that would produce extraordinary beauty while always carrying an undertone of impermanence, a sense that everything glorious might someday fall, because hadn't it already fallen once, and couldn't it fall again? In 784, Abd al-Rahman began construction of what would become the Great Mosque of Córdoba, known in Spanish as the Mezquita. He didn't start from nothing. On the site stood a Visigothic church, which itself had likely been built on the foundations of a Roman temple. This layering of sacred spaces, each faith building on what came before, would characterize much of Al-Andalus. Abd al-Rahman purchased the church from the Christian community. Accounts differ on whether this was a negotiated transaction or a polite fiction masking confiscation. But the official story was that the Christians were compensated and built a new church elsewhere. The mosque that began to rise on this site would eventually become one of the most distinctive buildings in the Islamic world, different from anything in Damascus or Baghdad, unique to Spain. The design was revolutionary in subtle ways. The builders faced a challenge: how to create a large interior space with limited building materials, particularly limited access to tall columns. The solution they devised was elegant. They used shorter columns, many of them salvaged from Roman buildings, and placed them in a forest-like arrangement throughout the prayer hall. Then, to achieve the necessary height, they built double arches, a horseshoe arch supporting a second, rounder arch above it. These arches were striped in alternating red brick and white stone, creating a visual effect unlike anything else in architecture. Walking into this prayer hall, even today, is to enter a kind of sacred forest. Columns extend in every direction, the striped arches creating rhythmic patterns of light and shadow, the eye drawn endlessly through space that seems to multiply itself, to extend beyond its actual boundaries. It's disorienting in the most peaceful way, like being lost in a grove where every direction looks the same, but somehow you're always safe. The mosque was oriented toward Mecca, as Islamic law required, though the Qibla wall, the wall that marks the direction of prayer, is actually slightly off from true east. Whether this was intentional, marking Mecca's position relative to Córdoba's specific location, or an error in calculation from those early days when surveying across continents was imprecise, remains debated. What matters is that this building declared Córdoba's connection to the larger Islamic world, while developing its own distinct architectural language. Abd al-Rahman didn't live to see the mosque completed. His successors would expand it repeatedly over the next 2 centuries, each ruler adding new sections, enlarging the prayer hall, making it more magnificent. By the 10th century, it could accommodate thousands of worshippers, and it had become not just a place of prayer, but a centre of learning, a library, a court. The spiritual and intellectual heart of Al-Andalus. But the original vision was Abd al-Rahman's, a building that honoured the Umayyad architectural tradition of Syria, while adapting to Spanish materials and conditions that created beauty through innovation rather than mere imitation, that declared Córdoba's arrival as a true capital city. He was building not just a mosque, but a statement that the Umayyads, though driven from Damascus, had created something just as magnificent here in the West, that Al-Andalus was not a backwater or an afterthought, but a civilization in its own right. The Great Mosque became the physical embodiment of what Al-Andalus aspired to be, a place where tradition and innovation coexisted, where influences from many sources combined into something new, where the sacred and the beautiful were inseparable, and it would stand, in one form or another, through all the centuries that followed, surviving even the fall of Al-Andalus itself, a reminder in stone and arch of what was once created there. Let that image rest in your mind as we move forward into the centuries when this culture truly flourished. A forest of columns, arches striped in red and white, light filtering through in patterns that shifted with the sun, creating spaces that invited contemplation and peace. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Córdoba had become one of the great intellectual centres of the world. At its heart was a profound commitment to knowledge that expressed itself most powerfully in translation. Arabic-speaking scholars in Al-Andalus were systematically translating the accumulated wisdom of previous civilizations, Greek philosophy and science, Persian literature and medicine, Indian mathematics, into Arabic, preserving and transmitting knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. This translation movement wasn't unique to Spain. The Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad had established their own House of Wisdom, a vast library and translation centre that became the model for similar efforts across the Islamic world. But what made the Andalusian version distinctive was its position at the western edge of the Islamic world, where it served as a bridge between the Muslim East and Christian Europe. Knowledge flowed into Al-Andalus from Baghdad and Damascus, was further developed and refined there, and then gradually seeped northward into Christian kingdoms that had lost direct access to ancient learning. Consider what was at stake in this work. Much of Greek philosophy existed only in manuscripts scattered across the Mediterranean world. Some texts survived in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, where Greek was still read. But large portions of the Greek intellectual tradition had been lost to Western Europe after the fall of Rome. Latin-speaking scholars in places like France and Italy simply didn't have access to Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, Euclid, the foundational thinkers of ancient civilization. Muslim scholars in Baghdad had already been translating these works into Arabic for over a century by the time the movement reached Al-Andalus. They translated Aristotle's philosophy, Ptolemy's astronomy, Galen's medical texts, Euclid's geometry. They didn't just translate passively, however. They studied, commented on, corrected, and expanded these works. An Arabic version of Aristotle often came with layers of interpretation and commentary from multiple scholars across generations. In Córdoba and other Andalusian cities, libraries grew to house these translated works. The Caliph's library in Córdoba was said to contain over 400,000 volumes, a number that's probably exaggerated but indicative of the scale of the collection. These weren't just religious texts, though those were certainly present. They were treatises on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, poetry, agriculture, music, every field of human knowledge that existed at the time. The process of translation required more than linguistic skill. It required understanding the concepts deeply enough to render them in a different language and cultural context. A medical text from ancient Greece, for instance, had to be translated in a way that made sense to physicians trained in the Islamic tradition. This meant negotiation between different ways of thinking about the body, disease and healing. It meant creating new vocabularies in Arabic for concepts that hadn't existed before. And it wasn't only from Greek into Arabic. Jewish scholars in Al-Andalus also participated in this translation culture, working between Hebrew, Arabic and eventually Latin. Christian scholars from the north came to cities like Toledo and Córdoba to learn Arabic and access the vast libraries there. By the 12th century, a reverse translation movement had begun, with scholars translating Arabic works into Latin, thereby reintroducing ancient Greek knowledge to Western Europe, knowledge that had been preserved and expanded in the Islamic world while Europe's access to it had diminished. This cultural exchange, this commitment to preserving and transmitting knowledge across linguistic and religious boundaries, was one of Al-Andalus's most significant contributions to world civilization. It wasn't always harmonious. There were debates, disagreements, accusations of heresy from those who feared pagan philosophy contaminating faith. But the work continued, driven by a conviction that knowledge itself was valuable, that understanding the world more clearly was a worthy pursuit regardless of where that knowledge originated. And this brings us naturally to the people who used this knowledge, the physicians and philosophers who took ancient learning and built upon it, creating new understanding that would influence the world for centuries to come. The medical knowledge accumulated in Al-Andalus was extraordinary for its time. Building on Greek texts by Galen and Hippocrates, on Persian and Indian medical traditions, and on their own observations and experiments, Andalusian physicians developed practices that were sophisticated and, by medieval standards, remarkably effective. They understood anatomy through careful study, even though religious prohibitions limited dissection. They diagnosed diseases with precision, compiled pharmacological guides listing hundreds of medicinal compounds, performed surgery when necessary, and maintained hospitals that served the poor as well as the wealthy. One of the most famous was al-Zahrawi, known in Latin as Abulcasis, who lived in the 10th century near Córdoba. He wrote a 30-volume medical encyclopedia that became the standard reference for surgery in Europe for over 500 years. His section on surgical instruments illustrated over 200 different tools, many of which he designed himself. He described techniques for everything from setting broken bones to removing cataracts from eyes, from dental surgery to treating bladder stones. What's striking about al-Zahrawi's work is not just the technical knowledge but the philosophical approach. He emphasized careful observation over received wisdom. He described cases where treatments failed as well as where they succeeded, allowing other physicians to learn from both. He advocated for cleanliness in surgical procedure, though the germ theory of disease wouldn't be discovered for another 1,000 years. He was systematically trying to understand the body as it actually functioned, not just as ancient texts said it should function. The same empirical spirit characterized Andalusian astronomy. astronomers in Córdoba and other cities made precise observations of celestial movements, compiled tables of planetary positions, designed and built sophisticated astronomical instruments like astrolabes and armillary spheres. They did this partly for religious purposes, determining the precise times for daily prayers, fixing the direction of Mecca, calculating the Islamic calendar, but also out of pure intellectual curiosity about how the heavens worked. An astronomer named al-Zarqali, working in Toledo in the 11th century, created astronomical tables so accurate they were used by European astronomers for centuries. He determined the length of the solar year with astonishing precision. His measurement was off by only 2 minutes from modern calculations. He discovered that the apparent motion of the sun's furthest and nearest points from Earth, what we now call the apsides of Earth's orbit, slowly changed over time. A discovery that wouldn't be fully explained until Newton developed gravitational theory 600 years later. These weren't just theoretical pursuits disconnected from daily life. The knowledge physicians accumulated saved lives, eased suffering, and extended human capability. The astronomical understanding allowed for better navigation, more accurate calendars, deeper comprehension of the cosmos. The mathematical innovations, particularly the adoption and development of what we now call Arabic numerals, originally from India, made calculation easier and more accessible, facilitating commerce, architecture, engineering, and every endeavour that required working with numbers. There was also what we might call early experimental science. Scholars studied optics, how light behaves and how vision works. They investigated chemistry, or what they called alchemy, trying to understand how substances transformed from one form to another. Much of this was still grounded in theory that would later be discarded, but the method, careful observation, experiment, logical deduction, was essentially scientific in a way that would influence the later development of modern science. The remarkable aspect of this intellectual culture was how it connected to the translation movement we discussed earlier. Physicians read ancient texts, tested the claims against their own observations, and wrote new texts that corrected or expanded on the ancients. Astronomers studied Ptolemy's model of the universe and then made observations that led them to propose modifications. Philosophers read Aristotle and then engaged with his arguments, agreeing with some points and challenging others. There was a living dialogue with the past, a sense that ancient wisdom deserved respect but not blind acceptance. This combination of reverence for learning and willingness to question, of building on tradition while seeking new understanding, created an intellectual climate that fostered innovation. It wasn't perfect. There were still limits imposed by religious doctrine, political considerations, and the social structures of the time. But within those constraints, something extraordinary was happening. The systematic pursuit of knowledge across religious and cultural boundaries, the preservation and expansion of human understanding, the creation of texts and tools and practices that would influence civilization for centuries after Al-Andalus itself had fallen. If you had walked through the countryside around Córdoba or Granada in the 10th century, you would have seen landscapes transformed in ways that still seem almost magical. This was the era when Al-Andalus became, quite literally, a garden. The Muslim rulers and settlers brought with them agricultural knowledge from the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. And they applied that knowledge with systematic intensity to the Spanish soil. The result was what historians call the Andalusian agricultural revolution. Crops that had never grown in Spain before, oranges, lemons, limes, rice, sugarcane, cotton, eggplant, spinach, artichokes, hard wheat, were introduced and flourished. Irrigation systems based on Roman foundations but vastly expanded and improved brought water to dry lands. The noria, a water wheel that lifted water from rivers to fields, became a common sight. Qanats, underground irrigation channels that minimized water loss through evaporation, were constructed across the southern regions. Terraced hillsides allowed farming on slopes that would otherwise have been unusable. This wasn't just practical agriculture. It was aesthetic, almost artistic in its conception. The Muslim tradition held that paradise was a garden, and that creating gardens on earth was a way of manifesting divine beauty in the physical world. So the agricultural developments of Al-Andalus included not just productive fields, but elaborate ornamental gardens, enclosed spaces with fruit trees, flowing water, fragrant flowers, shaded pathways, spaces designed for contemplation and peace. The Generalife Gardens in Granada, though built later in the 13th and 14th centuries, exemplify this tradition. Imagine walking through spaces where water flows in channels and fountains, where the sound of running water provides constant gentle music, where orange trees and cypresses create patterns of light and shadow, where jasmine and roses fill the air with fragrance. These weren't wild gardens, but carefully designed spaces, geometrically organised yet feeling natural, places where human design and natural growth achieved a kind of balance. The agricultural knowledge was recorded in farming manuals that circulated throughout Al-Andalus. These texts described in detail when to plant different crops, how to irrigate them, how to protect them from pests and disease, when to harvest. They discussed grafting techniques for fruit trees, breeding strategies for livestock, methods for improving soil fertility. This was systematic agricultural science, passed from generation to generation, constantly refined through experimentation and observation. The economic impact was substantial. The increased agricultural productivity supported larger urban populations. Córdoba at its peak in the 10th century may have had over 500,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. The surplus agricultural production could support not just farmers, but craftsmen, merchants, scholars, administrators, all the people who make an advanced civilization possible. The introduction of new crops created new industries, silk production, sugar refining, paper making, that further enriched the economy. But perhaps more important than the economic impact was the cultural meaning. Gardens in Al-Andalus were spaces where the three faiths could meet on neutral ground. Christian, Muslim and Jewish scholars might debate philosophy in a garden setting. Poets composed verses celebrating the beauty of specific gardens. Lovers met among the flowers and trees. Rulers held court in garden pavilions, conducting the business of state surrounded by beauty and the sound of flowing water. There's a poetic tradition in Al-Andalus that describes gardens in language that mixes the sensual and the spiritual, the earthly and the divine. A garden isn't just beautiful, it's a reminder of paradise. The fragrance of jasmine isn't just pleasant, it's a hint of eternal joy. The sound of water isn't just soothing, it's the voice of creation itself. This poetic consciousness, this way of seeing the physical world as infused with meaning beyond the merely material, permeated Andalusian culture. And as we contemplate these gardens, green and fragrant in a land that could be harsh and dry, we begin to see how Al-Andalus understood beauty not as decoration, but as essential to the good life, how they saw the transformation of the landscape as a spiritual as much as an economic endeavour, how they believed that creating paradise on earth was not just possible but obligatory. Let that image settle. The garden, the flowing water, the shade of fruit trees, the fragrance of flowers, as we move from the physical landscape to the human landscape, to the question of how people of different faiths actually live together in this remarkable place. The reality of convivencia, the Spanish word for living together, was complex. Neither the perfect harmony sometimes imagined, nor the constant conflict that marked other times and places. To understand what it actually meant for Christians, Muslims and Jews to share cities and streets in Al-Andalus, we need to look at the texture of daily life, the mundane interactions that defined coexistence more than any grand political arrangements. In a city like Córdoba in the 10th century, the different communities occupied distinct quarters but weren't strictly segregated. Muslims dominated the central areas near the Great Mosque and the administrative buildings. The Jewish quarter, the Juderia, was often nearby, as Jewish merchants and scholars had close connections to the Muslim court. Christian neighbourhoods existed on the peripheries. Though many Christians lived dispersed throughout the city, the boundaries were more social than physical. You knew when you passed from one neighbourhood to another by subtle shifts in language, in dress, in the food being sold in the markets, in the sounds emanating from windows and doorways. The markets, the souks, were genuinely mixed spaces. Muslim, Christian and Jewish merchants all sold goods, competed for customers and traded with each other. The gold and silver work, the leather goods that Córdoba was famous for, the textiles and spices and books, all of this flowed through markets where the three faiths conducted business together. The common language of commerce was increasingly Arabic, even for Christians and Jews, though Romance languages descended from Latin were still widely spoken, and Hebrew remained the language of Jewish religious life. Professional relationships crossed religious boundaries regularly. A Muslim physician might treat Christian patients. A Jewish translator might work for a Muslim caliph, converting Greek texts to Arabic. A Christian carpenter might build furniture for a Jewish merchant. These weren't necessarily deep personal friendships, but they were functional relationships. People working together because their skills and needs complemented each other. The legal structure acknowledged these religious differences. Muslims lived under Islamic law, Sharia, administered through Islamic courts. But Christians and Jews had the legal status of dhimmi, protected peoples, which meant they could practice their religions, maintain their own community structures, and adjudicate disputes within their communities according to their own religious laws. A Christian accused of a crime against another Christian would be tried in a Christian court according to Christian law. Only cases involving members of different faiths went to the Islamic courts, and even then the judges were expected to take into account the different legal traditions. This system was not equal in the modern sense. Muslims had privileges that Christians and Jews didn't. They could bear arms freely, while dhimmi faced restrictions. They could build new houses of worship more easily. They were exempt from the jizya tax. They held the highest political and military positions. The society had a clear hierarchy with Muslims at the top. But within that hierarchical structure, there was space for non-Muslims to thrive. Jewish physicians became wealthy and influential. Christian scholars participated in intellectual life. Successful merchants, regardless of faith, could accumulate significant wealth and social standing. There were also moments of tension and even violence. Riots occasionally erupted, usually sparked by religious zealots on one side or another who objected to the mixing of faiths. Christian martyrs in 9th century Córdoba deliberately provoked Muslim authorities by publicly insulting Muhammad, seeking execution and sainthood. Jewish communities sometimes faced pressure from both Muslim and Christian authorities. The system was stable but not static, constantly negotiating the boundaries between cooperation and separation, between tolerance and tension. What made it work to the degree that it did? Part of the answer is economic interdependence. The different communities needed each other for the economy to function properly. Part is the legal framework that provided clear rules and expectations. Part is the intellectual climate that valued learning over orthodoxy in many contexts. And part, perhaps, is simply that people who live side by side for generations, who trade in the same markets and walk the same streets, who share common problems like drought or plague or invasion, develop a pragmatic acceptance of difference that transcends theoretical tolerance. Children played together in the streets, though their parents might have been careful about how close those friendships became. Wedding celebrations in one community could be heard by neighbours of other faiths. The same festivals sometimes occurred simultaneously: the Muslim Eid, the Jewish Passover, the Christian Easter, and the city accommodated all of them. The rhythm of religious life creating a complex calendar where celebration was almost constant. It wasn't paradise, it was human society, with all the complications and contradictions that implies. But it was a form of coexistence that created space for extraordinary human achievement, that allowed different traditions to enrich each other, that demonstrated the possibility, however imperfect, of building something complex and beautiful from diversity rather than uniformity. The economic vitality of Al-Andalus was built on trade networks that stretched from northern Europe to sub-Saharan Africa, from the Atlantic coast to China. Córdoba and other Andalusian cities sat at the crossroads of multiple trade routes, making them natural commercial centres where goods and ideas from vast distances converged and mingled. From the north came amber from the Baltic, furs from Scandinavia, timber from the forests of Europe, slaves captured in warfare or raids, a dark trade that existed across medieval societies. From Africa came gold dust from Ghana, ivory, exotic animals, spices from East Africa that had originated even further east. From the eastern Mediterranean came silk from Constantinople, and beyond, gems and precious stones, fine ceramics, aromatic resins, paper from Samarkand. Each of these trade routes had been established long before the Islamic conquest, but Al-Andalus systematized and expanded them, creating a network of trusted merchants, standard weights and measures, financial instruments like letters of credit that allowed trade across vast distances without physically transporting gold or silver. The port cities played crucial roles in the system. Almeria on the southeastern coast, Malaga, Valencia, Seville on the Guadalquivir River. These cities had harbours where ships from across the Mediterranean docked, unloading cargo that would then be distributed inland. Maritime trade was dangerous in the medieval period, with storms and pirates constant threats, but the potential profits made the risks worthwhile. A merchant who successfully managed a trading voyage to Alexandria or Damascus could multiply his investment many times over. But trade wasn't just import and export. Al-Andalus developed significant manufacturing and craft industries. The leatherwork of Córdoba was famous across Europe and the Islamic world. Fine leather for bookbinding, for clothing, for furniture. The silk industry in Granada and other cities produced textiles that rivaled anything from China or Constantinople. Papermaking, learned from the East, became an important industry. Supporting the massive demand for books and documents that the scholarly culture created, ceramics, metalwork in gold and silver and bronze, glasswork, all of these crafts flourished. The organisation of these industries followed the guild model that would later become common across medieval Europe, but which Al-Andalus had developed earlier. Craftsmen in the same trade organised into associations that regulated quality, set prices, trained apprentices, and protected their mutual interests. The silk weavers had their guild, the leather workers theirs, the goldsmiths theirs. These guilds cut across religious lines. A guild might include Muslim, Christian and Jewish members, all working in the same trade, bound together by professional rather than religious identity. The markets themselves were carefully organised. Different goods had designated areas: the silk market, the spice market, the book market, the slave market. This organisation made trade more efficient. Buyers knew where to go to find what they needed. Sellers could concentrate in areas where customers would look for them. Market inspectors, mutasibs, enforced standards, checking weights and measures, inspecting the quality of goods, ensuring fair dealing. It wasn't perfect. Corruption existed. Merchants cheated when they could. Disputes were common. But the system provided a framework that facilitated trust and commerce. Banking, in a recognisable form, emerged from these trade networks. While Islamic law prohibited interest in the modern sense, financial instruments were developed that allowed for investment and profit-sharing arrangements that functioned similarly. Money changers operated booths where the various currencies that flow through Al-Andalus, Arabic dinars, Christian bezants, Jewish coins, could be exchanged. Letters of credit, known in the Islamic world as sak, from which the word check derives, allowed merchants to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another, facilitating long-distance trade without the risk of carrying large amounts of gold or silver. The prosperity this system generated was visible in the urban landscape. Wealthy merchants built elaborate houses around interior courtyards, with fountains and gardens, decorated with imported tiles and carved wood. They patronized poets and musicians, collected books and art, sponsored religious institutions and charitable works. The middle class of artisans and shopkeepers also enjoyed relative prosperity, able to afford decent housing, adequate food, some luxuries. Even the poor in Andalusian cities generally had access to public baths, to hospitals when sick, to mosques or churches that provided some social services. This economic foundation supported everything else: the scholarship, the arts, the elaborate court culture, the architectural achievements. Without the wealth that trade generated, without the productivity of the agricultural lands, without the surplus that allowed some people to devote themselves entirely to learning or art rather than survival, the golden age of Al-Andalus would not have been possible. And as we contemplate this commercial life, this movement of goods and people and ideas across vast distances, we begin to see how Al-Andalus was connected to the wider medieval world, how it served as a bridge between civilizations, how the spice from India, or the silk from China that ended up in a Córdoba market, represented networks of human connection that spanned continents and cultures. The merchant travelling from Córdoba to Damascus wasn't just conducting business, he was carrying news, ideas, books, songs, stories, all the intangible goods that move with physical commodities and that sometimes matter even more. Poetry in Al-Andalus wasn't a specialised art practiced by a small elite. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, from the court where poets competed for royal patronage, to the marketplace where street performers recited verses, from formal literary gatherings to intimate conversations between friends. To be educated meant, among other things, to know poetry, to appreciate its structures and meanings, and ideally to compose verses yourself. This was a culture that took the arrangement of words very seriously indeed. The Arabic poetic tradition that arrived with the conquest already had centuries of development behind it. Pre-Islamic Arabic poetry had established complex forms, like the qasida, a long poem with strict metre and rhyme that typically began with nostalgic remembrance of abandoned campsites before moving to themes of love, heroism, or wisdom. Muslim poets in the Eastern Islamic world had adapted and expanded these forms, and now in Al-Andalus poets were creating something new again, influenced by the landscape and mixed culture of Spain. One of the innovations that emerged was the muwashsha, a poetic form unique to Al-Andalus. Unlike the classical qasida with its monohime, the muwashsha had stanzas with varying rhyme schemes, creating more musical possibilities. And remarkably, these poems often concluded with a khaja, a final couplet in colloquial Romance language or Hebrew, rather than classical Arabic, sometimes put in the voice of a young woman expressing longing or love. This mixing of languages within a single poem, this blending of high and low registers, of Arabic literary tradition with Romance vernacular, created something that could only have emerged in Al-Andalus. The poets themselves came from all backgrounds. Ibn Hazm, an 11th century Muslim scholar, wrote The Ring of the Dove, a treatise on love and lovers that combined philosophy with poetry, analysing the psychology of love while illustrating points with verses. His work influenced later European concepts of courtly love. Samuel ibn Nagrela, a Jewish scholar who served as vizier to the Muslim king of Granada in the 11th century, wrote poetry in Hebrew that drew on Arabic forms while celebrating Jewish themes. His poems range from battlefield descriptions — he personally commanded armies despite being a scholar first — to meditations on exile and identity. Women poets, though rarer in the historical record due to the patriarchal nature of the society, did exist and were sometimes celebrated. Walidi, daughter of a Cordoban caliph in the 11th century, hosted a literary salon where poets of both sexes gathered. She wrote verses expressing desire and independence that shocked some contemporaries but earned respect from others. One of her poems, addressed to her lover Ibn Zaydun, himself a famous poet, playfully mocks him while also revealing genuine feeling. If you were true, you would not love others, / you would treat me with loyalty like I treat you. The relationship between Valida and Ibn Zaydun became legendary, their poetry to and about each other circulating widely, their complicated love affair a subject of commentary and analysis. Music was inseparable from poetry. Poems weren't just read silently or recited, they were sung, accompanied by instruments like the oud, a lute-like stringed instrument, the kanun, a type of zither, drums and flutes. The combination of poetry and music created performances that could last for hours, telling stories, exploring emotions, celebrating beauty, mourning loss. At the caliph's court, accomplished musicians were highly valued. The most famous was Ziryab, who arrived in Córdoba from Baghdad in the 9th century and revolutionized Andalusian musical culture. Ziryab introduced new musical modes, added a fifth string to the ode, established the order in which pieces should be performed in a concert, and reportedly knew over 10,000 songs by heart. But he was more than a musician. He also influenced fashion, introducing seasonal clothing styles. He promoted new culinary practices, arranging meals in courses from soups to desserts. He affected etiquette and manners at the court. In a real sense, Ziryab helped define what it meant to be cultured in Al-Andalus. The arts weren't separate domains, but aspects of a unified aesthetic approach to life. The philosophical understanding behind this artistic culture was that beauty served a higher purpose. It wasn't frivolous decoration, but a path to understanding truth. A well-crafted poem could reveal insights into the nature of love or mortality or divine beauty that philosophical treatises couldn't capture. Music could move the soul in ways that prepared it for spiritual understanding. The arrangement of words and sounds according to precise patterns mirrored the mathematical patterns that underlay the cosmos itself. Art, in this view, was a form of knowledge, one that engaged the emotions and senses in ways that complemented intellectual understanding. And this artistic sensibility permeated Andalusian culture at every level. Even a business letter might be composed with attention to rhetorical flourish. A conversation between educated friends would include quotes from poetry, allusions to famous verses, wordplay that demonstrated wit and learning. To lack appreciation for poetry was to lack an essential element of human cultivation, to be incomplete in a fundamental way. In the year 1135 in Córdoba, a child was born who would become one of the most important Jewish philosophers in history. His full name was Moses ben Maimon, known to the Jewish world as Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, or by the acronym Rambam, and to the Latin-speaking world as Maimonides. His life would span one of the most turbulent periods in Andalusian history, and his work would bridge the Jewish religious tradition with the philosophy of Aristotle, creating a synthesis that would influence not just Judaism, but also Christian and Islamic thought for centuries. Maimonides was born into a family of scholars and judges. His father was a learned man, deeply versed in Jewish law and tradition, and he ensured his son received the best education available. This meant in Al-Andalus learning not just the Torah and Talmud, but also Arabic language and literature, the Greek philosophy that had been translated into Arabic, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, the full curriculum of medieval Islamic education. Young Moses was brilliant and absorbed everything offered to him. But when he was around 13, everything changed. The Almohads, a fundamentalist dynasty from North Africa, invaded Al-Andalus, overthrowing the more tolerant ruling families and imposing strict interpretation of Islamic law. Non-Muslims faced a harsh choice: convert to Islam, leave, or die. This was a dramatic break from the previous pattern of Convivencia. The Almohads rejected the dhimmi system that had protected Jewish and Christian communities, demanding religious uniformity instead. Maimonides' family refused to convert but couldn't safely remain in Córdoba. They became wanderers, moving from city to city in southern Spain, trying to stay ahead of Almohad enforcement, always seeking places where they could practice Judaism without persecution. Eventually they left Spain entirely, crossing to North Africa, then to Palestine, and finally settling in Egypt, in the city of Fustat, now part of Cairo, where Maimonides would spend the rest of his life. This forced exile profoundly shaped Maimonides' thought. He had experienced firsthand the collapse of tolerance, the replacement of a complex multicultural society with religious intolerance. He had seen his family and community uprooted, had lost the land of his birth, and yet he continued to engage with the same intellectual traditions, Arabic philosophy, Islamic science, Greek thought, that he had learned in Al-Andalus. His work became, in a sense, a preservation and continuation of the Andalusian intellectual tradition, even after Al-Andalus itself had changed. His most famous work, The Guide for the Perplexed, written in Arabic but immediately translated into Hebrew and later Latin, attempted to reconcile Jewish religious faith with Aristotelian philosophy. For Jews who had been educated in Arabic philosophy, and who found apparent contradictions between what Aristotle said and what the Torah taught, Maimonides offered a sophisticated framework for understanding both. He argued that the Torah contained layers of meaning, literal, allegorical, philosophical, and that properly understood, revelation and reason didn't conflict but complemented each other. This was philosophically daring work. He argued that many biblical descriptions of God that seem to attribute physical characteristics to the divine should be understood metaphorically. He proposed that prophecy was a natural phenomenon involving the perfection of the human intellect, rather than a purely supernatural event. He tried to prove God's existence through philosophical argument, rather than relying solely on scriptural authority. All of this put him at odds with more traditionalist Jewish scholars who felt he was subordinating faith to philosophy, letting Greek thought contaminate Jewish tradition. But Maimonides was also deeply engaged with Jewish law. He wrote the Mishneh Torah, a comprehensive code of Jewish law that organized and systematized centuries of rabbinical discussion and debate. This 14-volume work became one of the foundational texts of rabbinic Judaism, studied and commented on by every generation since. In it, Maimonides showed the same philosophical rigor he applied to reconciling faith and reason, creating clear logical structures for understanding religious obligation. His life in Egypt was extraordinarily productive but also exhausting. He supported his family by working as a physician, eventually becoming physician to the Sultan's court. He wrote letters responding to questions from Jewish communities across the Mediterranean world about matters of law and theology. He composed medical treatises that demonstrated his mastery of both ancient medical knowledge and contemporary practice. He led the Jewish community in Egypt as their chief rabbi. The demands on his time were relentless. There's a letter Maimonides wrote describing his daily routine that gives a sense of the pressure he lived under. He would rise early and attend the Sultan and members of the court, diagnosing illnesses, prescribing treatments, supervising the care of patients. This would take much of the day. When he returned home, he would find his waiting room filled with people, Muslims and Jews, wealthy and poor, all seeking medical care or rabbinical advice. He would work through the evening seeing them. Only late at night, exhausted, could he turn to his scholarly work, the writing and study that he considered his true calling. And yet from this impossible schedule emerged works of profound philosophical and religious importance, texts that would be studied by Jewish, Christian and Muslim scholars for centuries. His work represented the very best of what the Andalusian intellectual tradition had aspired to: the careful integration of different sources of knowledge, the respect for both revelation and reason, the conviction that truth from whatever source was valuable and worthy of serious engagement. Maimonides died in Egypt in 1204 at age 69, having spent more of his life outside Al-Andalus than within it. But he remained, in a deep sense, a product of Andalusian culture, carrying its intellectual traditions forward even as the place that had created them was changing in ways that made them increasingly difficult to sustain. While Maimonides was working in Egypt to reconcile Jewish faith with Aristotelian philosophy, another philosopher was attempting a similar synthesis for Islam. Ibn Rushd, known in Latin as Averroes, was born in Córdoba in 1126, almost the same generation as Maimonides. Like Maimonides, he came from a family of scholars and judges. Like Maimonides, he would spend his life trying to show that philosophy and religion, properly understood, supported rather than contradicted each other. And like Maimonides, his work would have profound influence far beyond his own religious tradition. Averroes lived during the last century of Muslim rule in most of Spain. The Almohads who had driven Maimonides' family into exile controlled much of Al-Andalus during Averroes' lifetime. Initially, the Almohad rulers patronized learning. Averroes served as a judge in Seville and Córdoba, and as personal physician to the caliph. But the Almohads were also increasingly suspicious of philosophy, seeing it as potentially heretical, as undermining religious orthodoxy. This tension would eventually engulf Averroes himself. His great project was defending philosophy against religious critics and clarifying the relationship between revealed truth and philosophical truth. In works like The Incoherence of the Incoherence, he responded to earlier Muslim theologians who had attacked philosophy as incompatible with Islam. Averroes argued that religion and philosophy addressed the same truths, but from different perspectives and for different audiences. The masses needed concrete imagery and stories. The educated elite could understand abstract philosophical arguments. Both led to truth, but by different paths. His most important contribution was his extensive commentaries on Aristotle. Averroes read Aristotle more carefully and systematically than perhaps any previous Muslim or Christian philosopher. He wrote 3 types of commentary on most of Aristotle's works: short summaries for beginners, intermediate commentaries for students, and long, detailed line-by-line analyses for advanced scholars. These commentaries became so influential that in the Latin-speaking world, Averroes was simply called Quote 11, just as Aristotle was Quote 12. What Averroes found in Aristotle was a comprehensive rational system for understanding reality, metaphysics explaining what exists, logic providing methods for valid reasoning, ethics teaching how to live well, politics describing just social organization, natural philosophy investigating the physical world. This system didn't require divine revelation to work. It could be constructed through careful observation and logical thought. And yet, Averroes argued, properly understood it didn't contradict revelation. Instead, it complemented it. This led him to controversial positions. He believed the universe was eternal, not created in time, a view that conflicted with the traditional Islamic understanding of creation. He argued that individual human souls didn't survive death in the way commonly believed, but rather that something he called the active intellect, the capacity for abstract thought shared by all humans, was immortal and universal rather than individual. These ideas would be condemned by both Islamic and Christian authorities as heretical. Yet Averroes maintained he was a faithful Muslim. He fulfilled all religious obligations, served as a judge applying Islamic law, defended the truth of revelation. But he insisted that faith and reason were both valid paths to truth, and where they seemed to conflict, the problem was misunderstanding one or both, not genuine contradiction. The Quran itself, he argued, encouraged rational inquiry and intellectual investigation. Philosophy wasn't a threat to religion, but its natural completion. For a time, this balancing act worked. He enjoyed the patronage of 2 successive Almohad caliphs, wrote prolifically, taught students, served the state in various capacities. But in 1195, late in his life, the political climate shifted. Conservative religious scholars convinced the caliph that philosophy was indeed dangerous, that it led to heresy and undermined faith. Averroes was called before the court. Accused of spreading false teachings, his books were burned. He was sent into internal exile in a small town and forbidden to teach. The exile didn't last long, political pressures shifted again, and he was recalled to the court in Marrakesh, partially rehabilitated. But the damage was done. He died in 1198, at 72, having seen his life's work publicly condemned by the authorities he had served. His book survived, but primarily because they had already spread beyond Al-Andalus into Christian Europe, where Latin-speaking scholars were eagerly reading translations of his Aristotle commentaries. The irony is that Averroes had far greater influence on Christian philosophy than on Islamic thought. In the universities of Paris and Oxford in the 13th century, his commentaries on Aristotle became foundational texts. Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic philosopher-theologian, engaged extensively with Averroes' interpretations, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing, but always taking him seriously as a profound thinker. The attempt to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian revelation that characterized medieval scholasticism owed much to Averroes' earlier attempt to reconcile Aristotle with Islam. In the Islamic world, by contrast, Averroes' philosophical project was largely abandoned. The suspicion of philosophy that had led to his exile deepened over the following centuries. Islamic thought took other directions, emphasizing theology and mysticism over the systematic rational investigation that Averroes had championed. The golden age of Islamic philosophy, which had flourished in Baghdad and Córdoba, gradually came to an end. But the questions Averroes asked, how do faith and reason relate? Can religion and philosophy coexist? Should revealed truth trump rational inquiry or vice versa? These questions didn't die with him. They're still being asked in various forms, wherever religious faith and intellectual inquiry meet. And the answers he proposed, however imperfect, represented a genuine attempt to honour both the demands of reason and the claims of revelation, to find space in a single life and a single mind for both philosophical rigour and religious devotion. The libraries of Al-Andalus were legendary. The Caliph's library in Córdoba, in its 10th century glory, was said to contain 400,000 volumes. Even if this number is exaggerated, and historians debate whether it is, the scale was extraordinary by medieval standards. Consider that the largest library in Christian Europe at that time might have contained a few hundred manuscripts, laboriously hand-copied by monks in monastery scriptoriums. The contrast illustrates how central books and learning were to Andalusian culture. These weren't just storage facilities for dusty manuscripts. Libraries in Al-Andalus were active centres of learning, where scholars gathered to read, to copy texts, to discuss ideas. The Caliph's library had a staff of specialists, librarians who organised and catalogued the collection, copyists who reproduced important texts, translators who worked between Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, scholars who researched specific topics, teachers who instructed students. It was an institution dedicated to the production and dissemination of knowledge. The private libraries of wealthy individuals could also be substantial. A prosperous merchant might own thousands of books. A scholar would accumulate a working library in his field, medical texts for a physician, legal works for a judge, philosophical treatises for a philosopher. Books were valuable but not prohibitively expensive, because paper had become relatively cheap and abundant. The introduction of paper-making technology from China, transmitted through the Islamic world to Al-Andalus, revolutionized book production. Paper was cheaper and easier to work with than parchment, which required animal skins and was labour-intensive to prepare. With paper, books could be produced more quickly and cheaply, making them accessible to a broader segment of society. The book markets in major cities were substantial operations. In Córdoba, an entire street was devoted to selling books, bookshops where you could purchase copies of popular works, scriptoriums where you could commission specific texts to be copied, binding workshops where books were assembled and decorated. Walking through this market would have been an overwhelming sensory experience. The smell of paper and ink, the sound of scribes' pens scratching across pages, booksellers calling out their wares, scholars debating the merits of different editions or translations. The content of these libraries reflected the breadth of intellectual interests in Al-Andalus. Religious texts, certainly. The Quran with its many commentaries, hadith collections recording the Prophet's sayings and actions, legal treatises, theological works, but also Greek philosophy, medical texts from multiple traditions, astronomical tables and treatises, mathematical works including the algebra developed by Muslim scholars. The word quote 14 comes from the Arabic quote 15. Geographical descriptions of the known world, historical chronicles, literary works, poetry anthologies. Agricultural manuals, books on music theory, on chess strategy, on dream interpretation, on virtually any subject that had attracted human curiosity. The libraries preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. When Greek manuscripts were destroyed or lost in Europe during the invasions and chaos that followed Rome's fall, copies often survived in Arabic translation in libraries like Córdoba's. Centuries later, when European scholars began seeking this lost knowledge, they frequently had to work backwards from Arabic versions to recreate Latin translations of Greek originals that no longer existed in the West. But the libraries weren't just about preservation, they were about expansion. Scholars built on what previous generations had learned, correcting errors, adding new observations, proposing new theories. An astronomical text might include the ancient Greek observations, but then add centuries of Muslim astronomical data, making more accurate predictions. A medical text might summarize Galen, but then describe new surgical techniques or newly discovered medicinal plants. Each generation stood on the shoulders of previous generations, seeing a bit further, understanding a bit more. The pursuit of knowledge in this culture had an almost sacred quality. Learning was valued for its own sake, not just for practical applications. Studying the movements of the stars or the arguments of ancient philosophers was seen as getting closer to divine truth, understanding more about the nature of reality that God had created. There was a hadith, a saying attributed to Muhammad, that circulated widely in the Islamic world. Seek knowledge, even unto China. This became a kind of motto for the scholarly culture. Knowledge wherever it could be found was valuable and worth pursuing. The educational system built around these libraries ranged from informal to highly structured. Young children learned to read and memorize the Quran in elementary schools attached to mosques. More advanced students studied with individual scholars, reading texts under their guidance, memorizing important passages, engaging in discussion and debate. The most accomplished students might travel from city to city seeking out renowned teachers in different fields, a practice that created networks of scholars across the Islamic world who had studied with the same masters and shared common intellectual frameworks. There were no universities in Al-Andalus in the formal sense that would later develop in Europe. But there were institutions that functioned similarly. Madrasas where Islamic law and theology were taught systematically, libraries where advanced research occurred, scholarly circles where new ideas were debated. The less formal structure meant more flexibility but also less standardization. A student's education depended heavily on which teachers they found and which texts they managed to access. Women participated in this scholarly culture less visibly than men, but not entirely absent. Some women became accomplished poets and calligraphers. Others served as teachers, particularly for female students. A few achieved recognition as scholars in their own right, though the patriarchal nature of the society meant their opportunities were limited compared to men's. The existence of such women, though, indicates that the pursuit of knowledge wasn't absolutely restricted by gender, that exceptional women could find paths to learning even within a system that generally privileged men. The architecture of Al-Andalus created spaces that transformed light itself into beauty, into something almost tangible, almost musical. Walk into the great Mosque of Córdoba, into that forest of columns and double arches we visited earlier, and what you experience is light filtered through space, in patterns that shift throughout the day as the sun moves across the sky. The striped arches create rhythmic shadows. The columns multiply the available space, making the interior seem larger than its actual dimensions. The whole structure feels designed not just to enclose space, but to sculpt it, to make it meaningful. This attention to light characterized Andalusian architecture across all its forms. In the Alhambra Palace in Granada, Built in the 13th and 14th centuries during the final centuries of Muslim rule, light enters through geometric screens called mashrabiyah, wooden lattices with intricate patterns that filter sunlight into complex shadows moving across walls and floors. The effect is mesmerizing, contemplative, transforming a functional need, windows to let in air and light, into an aesthetic and spiritual experience. The geometric patterns themselves had philosophical and mathematical dimensions. Islamic art generally avoided representational imagery of living things in religious contexts, based on concerns about idolatry. This restriction paradoxically created enormous freedom for abstract geometric and vegetal decoration. Artists and architects developed extraordinarily sophisticated geometric patterns, stars and polygons interlocking in complex tessellations, arabesques where vegetal forms curve and interweave endlessly, calligraphy where text becomes decorative and decoration becomes text. These patterns weren't random or merely decorative. They were based on mathematical principles, symmetry, proportion, repetition. Creating them required deep understanding of geometry, and they were thought to reflect cosmic order, the mathematical structures that underlay reality itself. Looking at these patterns, contemplating their complexity and order, was understood as a form of meditation, a way of perceiving the divine order that structured the universe. The use of water in Andalusian architecture elevated it from functional element to artistic medium. Courtyards featured fountains, channels, reflecting pools that served practical purposes, cooling the air, providing drinking water, facilitating ablutions before prayer, but also aesthetic and spiritual ones. The sound of flowing water created a constant peaceful background music. The visual reflection of architecture in still water doubled its beauty, created spaces that existed partly in physical reality and partly in reflection. The movement of water in fountains animated space, adding the dimension of time to the static elements of stone and tile. Gardens, as we discussed earlier, were integral to architectural design. A building wasn't complete without its garden, without the integration of constructed space and cultivated nature. The general life in Granada demonstrates this integration perfectly. The palace structures and the gardens aren't separate. They flow into each other, with interior courtyards that are gardens, with windows and doorways perfectly framed to create views into planted spaces, with water channels that begin inside buildings and flow into exterior pools. Colour played essential roles in creating these experiences. The tiles that covered walls and floors in Andalusian buildings weren't plain but richly decorated in blues, greens, yellows, and other hues created from mineral and vegetable dyes. The patterns created in these tiles, geometric, vegetal, calligraphic, used colour to define forms and create contrasts. A wall covered in these tiles wasn't a barrier but a surface alive with pattern and colour, something that invited extended contemplation. The horseshoe arch, which became almost a signature of Andalusian architecture, served both practical and aesthetic purposes. Structurally, this shape distributed weight effectively, allowing for larger openings than simpler arch forms. Aesthetically, the curve of the horseshoe arch was elegant, dynamic, drawing the eye upward and through the space it framed. Used repeatedly in arcades and colonnades, these arches created rhythmic patterns that organized space and movement through buildings. The interiors of important buildings were often covered in muqarnas, a form of decorative vaulting that created three-dimensional honeycomb-like structures of small niches and corbels. Looking up at a muqarna's dome was like looking into a geometric heaven, where the ceiling seemed to dissolve into complex patterns that suggested infinity. These weren't structural elements, strictly speaking. They were decorative surfaces applied to structural domes and vaults, but they transformed ceiling planes into spaces of contemplation and wonder. All of this architectural sophistication served not just aesthetic purposes, but functional and social ones. Buildings created appropriate spaces for the activities they housed, mosques for worship and community gathering, palaces for governance and representation, private homes for family life. bathhouses for hygiene and social interaction, markets for commerce. The architecture shaped how these activities unfolded, facilitating movement and interaction in ways that felt natural because they were so carefully considered. And perhaps most importantly, this architecture was fundamentally public. Yes, there were private palaces and homes, but the great achievements, the mosques, the palaces, the gardens, were, to varying degrees, accessible. A person of modest means could walk through the courtyard of the great mosque, could visit public gardens, could use the bathhouses, could move through urban spaces that had been designed with beauty and meaning. Architecture wasn't just for the wealthy, but for the entire community, a shared inheritance that elevated daily life. As we contemplate these buildings, these spaces of light and water and pattern, we see how Al-Andalus understood the physical environment as shaping human experience, how they believed that surrounding people with beauty would cultivate beauty in their souls, how architecture could be simultaneously practical and spiritual, functional and transcendent. The Christian kingdoms of northern Spain had never disappeared during the centuries of Muslim dominance. Small realms in the mountainous regions, Asturias, Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, had maintained their independence, sometimes paying tribute to Córdoba, sometimes raiding Muslim lands, always preserving their Christian identity and Latin culture. By the 11th century, these kingdoms were becoming stronger, more organized, and increasingly capable of challenging Muslim control of the peninsula. The process called the Reconquista, the Reconquest, is often portrayed as a religious crusade, Christians fighting to reclaim Spain from Muslim rule. There's some truth to this interpretation, particularly in later centuries when crusading ideology from the wider European context influenced Spanish affairs. But the reality was more complex, more pragmatic, more intertwined than a simple narrative of Christian versus Muslim warfare. Christian kings often allied with Muslim Taifa rulers against other Christians. El Cid, as mentioned, fought for Muslim Zaragoza against Christian Aragon. Christian and Muslim nobles sometimes intermarried. Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile had relationships with Muslim women, and some Muslim rulers had Christian wives or concubines. The tribute payments that Taifa kings made to Christian kingdoms created economic interdependence. War alternated with peace, raids with trade, conflict with cooperation. The advance southward was gradual, measured in decades and centuries rather than years. A Christian kingdom would conquer a border fortress, establish control over surrounding territory, settle Christian colonists in newly conquered lands, and then pause to consolidate before the next expansion. The pattern repeated across centuries: conquest, consolidation, expansion. Inch by inch, decade by decade, the frontier moved south. The fall of Toledo in 1085 was a watershed moment. This ancient city, with its history as the Visigothic capital, its strategic location in the centre of the peninsula, and its rich cultural heritage, represented more than just another conquered territory. Alfonso VI, who took the city after a siege, styled himself _18, acknowledging that he now ruled over significant Muslim and Jewish populations. He allowed the Great Mosque to remain, initially, protected the Jewish community, and tried to maintain the multicultural character of the city while asserting Christian political control. Toledo under Christian rule became an important centre for translation, just as it had been under Muslim rule. But now the direction changed. Instead of translating Greek works into Arabic, scholars in 12th century Toledo translated Arabic works into Latin. The Quote 19 wasn't a formal institution, but a loose network of scholars, often working in pairs, one who knew Arabic, one who knew Latin, collaborating to make the knowledge preserved in Arabic available to Latin-reading Europe. Gerard of Cremona, an Italian scholar who settled in Toledo in the mid-12th century, translated over 70 works from Arabic to Latin, including Ptolemy's _quote _20 _, the comprehensive astronomical work. Euclid's Elements, medical texts, philosophical works, and Aristotle's quote 22 and quote 23 via the Arabic translations and commentaries. This work of recovering ancient knowledge through Arabic intermediaries was essential to what historians call the _24_ in Europe, the intellectual flowering that preceded and prepared for the later European Renaissance. The Christian kingdoms also absorbed cultural influences from Al-Andalus even as they conquered it. The Mudejar style of architecture, Christian buildings using Islamic architectural techniques and decorative elements, became widespread in reconquered territories. The horseshoe arches, decorative tile work, geometric patterns that had characterized Muslim buildings appeared in Christian churches and palaces. The fusion created something distinctive to Spain, neither purely Islamic nor purely Christian in aesthetic, but a synthesis that reflected the complex reality of the peninsula. Yet the nature of Convivencia was changing. Under Muslim rule, Christians and Jews had been protected minorities with defined legal status. Under Christian rule, Muslims, called Mudejar, and Jews faced similar situations but in a Christian rather than Islamic legal framework. Initially, in newly conquered cities like Toledo, the arrangement was similar: protected status, ability to practice religion, internal self-governance. But over time, pressures increased. Christian religious authorities were less comfortable with the presence of mosques and synagogues than Muslim authorities had been with churches. Popular anti-Semitism, never entirely absent, periodically erupted into violence. The situation remained complicated but was trending toward less tolerance. The military religious orders, the Knights of Santiago, Calatrava, Alcantara, played increasing roles in the Reconquest, bringing crusading ideology more explicitly into Spanish affairs. These were warrior monks, committed to fighting Muslims as a religious duty, settled in frontier regions to defend and expand Christian territory. Their presence militarized the frontier in new ways and introduced a more absolutist vision of Christian dominance. By the 13th century, the Christian advance had reduced Muslim control to the southern regions, primarily the Kingdom of Granada. The great conquests of that century saw Córdoba fall in 1236 and Seville in 1248. These were catastrophic losses for Muslim Spain. Córdoba, the ancient capital, the city of the great mosque and the libraries, passing under Christian control marked a symbolic end to an era. When Ferdinand III of Castile entered Córdoba, the great mosque was converted into a cathedral, though the building itself was preserved largely intact. The pattern of conquest often involved negotiated surrenders rather than prolonged sieges. Muslim populations were sometimes allowed to leave peacefully, taking their portable property with them and relocating to Granada or North Africa. Sometimes they stayed, accepting Mudejar status under Christian rule. The specifics varied by location and circumstance, but the overall trend was clear. The Christian kingdoms were slowly, inexorably reconquering the peninsula. By the mid-13th century, Muslim control of the Iberian Peninsula had shrunk to a single kingdom in the mountainous southeast, the Nasrid Emirate of Granada. This small state, protected by the Sierra Nevada mountains and sustained by rich agricultural lands and Mediterranean trade, would survive for another 2.5 centuries while all other Muslim territories fell to Christian reconquest. Granada became a refuge, the last place in Western Europe where Muslim culture could flourish, where the traditions of Al-Andalus could continue even as the territory that had nurtured them disappeared. The founder of this last Muslim kingdom was Muhammad ibn Nasr, called Ibn al-Rahman, quote 25, who established control over Granada in 1238. He was a pragmatic ruler who understood that survival required accommodation with the Christian kingdoms. He became a vassal to Castile, paying tribute, providing military support when requested, acknowledging Christian suzerainty in exchange for being allowed to maintain his kingdom. It was a humiliating arrangement by some measures, but it bought time, 250 years of time, during which Granada became a final flowering of Andalusian culture. The kingdom was small, perhaps 15,000 square kilometres at most, including the cities of Granada, Malaga and Almeria, surrounded by mountain barriers that provided natural defences. The population included Muslims who had fled from territories conquered by Christians, bringing with them skills, knowledge, and the cultural traditions of lost cities. Granada became concentrated Andalusian culture. All the achievements of Al-Andalus compressed into a small mountain kingdom. The economic foundation was agriculture. The Vegas, fertile plains, irrigated by systems inherited and improved from earlier periods, produced grain, fruits, olives, grapes. The mountains provided minerals and supported livestock. Malaga and Almeria were ports connecting Granada to North Africa and the wider Mediterranean trade networks. Silk production became a major industry. Granada silk, famous for its quality across Europe and the Islamic world. The kingdom was wealthy enough to support a sophisticated court culture and to pay the tribute demanded by Castile. The Jewish population in Granada was substantial and important. Jewish merchants facilitated trade with Christian kingdoms and North Africa. Jewish scholars, physicians and administrators served the Nasrid court. The relationship between the Muslim rulers and Jewish communities was generally good, based on mutual benefit and long tradition. This would make the later fate of Granada's Jews particularly poignant. The Nasrid sultans, like the Taifa kings before them, used cultural patronage to legitimize their rule. They built extensively, creating what would become the Alhambra, the palace complex that represents the pinnacle of Andalusian architecture. They supported poets and scholars, collected manuscripts, maintained the traditions of learning that had characterized Al-Andalus. In a sense, Granada in the 14th and 15th centuries was both a genuine continuation of Andalusian culture and a deliberately constructed memorial to it, as if the Nasrid rulers understood they were preserving something that might not survive much longer. Life in Granada had a bittersweet quality. On one hand, the kingdom was prosperous, cultured, beautiful, the last place where you could experience the full richness of Andalusian civilization. On the other hand, everyone knew it existed on borrowed time, that eventually the Christian kingdoms would complete the Reconquest. This awareness permeates the poetry and art of the period. There's a kind of elegiac tone, a consciousness that everything beautiful is also temporary, that glory inevitably passes. The Alhambra itself embodies this consciousness. Built primarily in the 14th century during the reigns of Yusuf I and Muhammad V, the palace complex is a masterwork of light and water, geometry and calligraphy, garden and building integrated into an extraordinary whole. But it's also clearly a statement about what Al-Andalus had been. A declaration in stone and stucco and tile that this culture had created something of lasting value, something worth remembering even after the political state that created it had vanished. The palace inscriptions, carved in Arabic calligraphy across walls and ceilings, repeat certain phrases again and again. وَلَا غَالِبَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ, there is no victor but God. This phrase, the Nasrid dynasty motto, appears hundreds of times throughout the Alhambra. It's both a statement of faith and perhaps an acknowledgement of human powerlessness, a recognition that all earthly power is temporary and that ultimate sovereignty belongs to God alone. For a kingdom that survived through compromise and tribute, whose rulers knew they held power only with Christian permission, this motto had particular resonance. The Christian kingdoms, particularly Castile under the Trastamara dynasty, were content to let Granada survive as a tributary state. The tribute was valuable, and the kingdom posed no military threat. There were occasional border conflicts and raids in both directions, but major warfare was rare. Granada's survival served Christian purposes. It provided an outlet for Muslim populations from conquered territories, maintained trade connections and paid regular tribute. But this equilibrium couldn't last forever. By the late 15th century, the political situation in Christian Spain was changing. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 united the two most powerful Christian kingdoms. The new monarchy was more centralised, more powerful, and more committed to religious uniformity than previous rulers had been. Granada, the last Muslim holdout, became increasingly anomalous. A final task to complete the Reconquest that had been ongoing for 7 centuries. To understand the Alhambra is to understand the culmination of 7 centuries of Andalusian artistic and architectural achievement. The name comes from Arabic quote 28, quote 29, referring to the reddish colour of the walls, particularly visible at sunset when the stone seems to glow. But to call it merely a fortress misses its essential character. It's a palace complex, a citadel. A small city within walls, and above all, a work of art at architectural scale. The Alhambra sits on a hilltop overlooking Granada, the Sierra Nevada mountains rising behind it, the fertile Vega spreading below. The location is both strategic, easily defended, commanding views, and aesthetic, the palace positioned to maximize the beauty of its natural setting. Approaching the Alhambra, you first encounter massive fortifications, towers and walls that speak of military function. But once inside, the character changes entirely. You enter spaces designed for beauty and contemplation rather than defense. The Court of the Lions, perhaps the most famous space in the Alhambra, exemplifies Nasrid architectural genius. It's a courtyard surrounded by slender columns supporting horseshoe arches, creating a colonnade around the central space. In the middle sits the Fountain of the Lions, 12 stone lions arranged in a circle, supporting a basin from which water flows through their mouths. Water channels radiate from the fountain to 4 directions, dividing the courtyard into quarters. The quadripartite garden design that represents paradise in Islamic tradition. But what makes this space extraordinary isn't just its structure, but its effects. The columns are so slender, so closely spaced, that walking through the colonnade creates a constant shifting perspective. The space multiplies itself in visual echoes. The light filtering through creates ever-changing patterns. The sound of flowing water provides constant gentle music. The whole space invites lingering contemplation, the slowing down of time. The walls and ceilings are covered in stucco carved in geometric and vegetal patterns of astonishing intricacy. These aren't merely decorative, they're 3-dimensional constructions where light and shadow create depth and movement. Looking at these surfaces, your eye can never quite settle because the patterns are so complex, so rich in detail at every scale. There's always something more to see, always another layer of complexity revealing itself. Interwoven with the geometric patterns is calligraphy, Arabic script transformed into architectural ornament. The text includes Quranic verses, poetry praising the palace and its builders, and repeatedly the Nasrid motto, quote 30. The calligraphy becomes purely visual for those who can't read Arabic pattern and texture. But for those who could read it, the walls literally speak, the architecture reciting poetry and scripture. The Hall of the Ambassadors, in the Commerce Tower, served as the throne room where the Sultan received visitors and conducted state business. It's a large square room with a spectacular wooden ceiling, a dome constructed of thousands of small pieces of wood fitted together in complex geometric patterns representing the 7 heavens of Islamic cosmology. Looking up at this ceiling is like gazing into a geometric cosmos. The interlocking stars and polygons suggesting infinite complexity and order. The windows in this room are positioned and sized to create specific lighting effects at different times of day. Morning light enters from one direction, afternoon from another, the quality of light in the room constantly changing with the sun's movement. The builders understood light as a medium to work with, to shape and control for aesthetic and symbolic purposes. Throughout the Alhambra, water is everywhere, in fountains, channels, pools, both for practical cooling and for aesthetic and symbolic reasons. The sound of water moving creates an acoustic environment distinct from any other architectural space. The visual reflections, buildings mirrored in still pools, light sparkling on moving water, create layers of reality. the physical structure and its reflection equally important. The integration of architecture and garden reaches its peak in the relationship between the Alhambra and the Generalife, the summer palace and gardens on the adjacent hill. From certain windows in the Alhambra, you see carefully framed views of the Generalife gardens. From the Generalife you see the Alhambra positioned against the mountains. The two complexes create a dialogue across space, each enhancing the other. There's a quality of deliberate impermanence in some of the Alhambra's construction. This stucco work, so elaborate and beautiful, is also fragile. Not built to last for millennia, but created for immediate effect. This wasn't laziness or poor craftsmanship, but perhaps a different understanding of art's relationship to time. The beauty was meant to be experienced now, in this moment, not necessarily to endure forever. There's a kind of poignancy in this, the creation of such beauty with the implicit understanding that it might not last. The poetry carved into the walls sometimes addresses the building itself, personifying the palace as a living entity. One poem speaks from the perspective of the building, declaring its beauty and the glory of its builder. Another addresses the Sultan, assuring him of the palace's loyalty and service. These poetic inscriptions create a layered reality where the building isn't just a setting for human action, but a participant, a character in its own story. When Ferdinand and Isabella finally conquered Granada in 1492, they were reportedly struck by the beauty of the Alhambra. Unlike many buildings in conquered cities, the Alhambra was preserved rather than destroyed or fundamentally altered. They recognized, perhaps, that it represented achievement beyond politics or religion, that it was simply beautiful and worthy of preservation regardless of who had built it, or for what purposes. The Alhambra became a kind of memorial, a preserved piece of a vanished culture. Over the following centuries, parts fell into decay, were damaged by earthquakes, were even used as stables and storage at various times. But the essential structures survived, and in the 19th century, when European Romantic artists and writers discovered the Alhambra, it became famous worldwide as perhaps the most beautiful building the medieval world had produced, a final flowering of Andalusian architecture, created with full knowledge that the culture that built it was approaching its end. The year 1492 stands as one of the most significant in Spanish history, perhaps in world history, marking endings and beginnings that would reshape continents, for Granada and for Al-Andalus. It was the year when 7 centuries of Muslim presence in Spain came to an end, when the last thread connecting Spain to the Islamic world was finally cut. The siege of Granada began in 1491. Ferdinand and Isabella had spent the previous decade conquering other territories in the Nasrid kingdom. Malaga had fallen in 1487, Almeria shortly after. Granada itself, the capital, remained. The Catholic monarchs, as Ferdinand and Isabella were called, assembled a massive army and settled in for a prolonged siege, building a new city, Santa Fe, to house their troops and court during the months-long effort. The siege was more a matter of patience than assault. The Christian forces surrounded Granada, cutting off supplies, waiting for hunger and desperation to do what military assault might not accomplish efficiently. Inside the city, the situation was complicated by internal divisions. The last Nasrid Sultan, Muhammad XII, called Boabdil by Spanish sources, faced opposition from his own uncle, who controlled parts of the kingdom and resisted surrender. The political unity that might have allowed prolonged resistance was absent. Negotiations occurred throughout the siege. Boabdil understood that military victory was impossible. The Christian kingdoms were too strong, too unified, too committed. The question was what terms could be obtained for surrender. The resulting Treaty of Granada, signed in November 1491, was remarkably generous on paper. Muslims would be allowed to keep their property, practice their religion freely, maintain their mosques, be governed according to Islamic law in internal matters, be protected from forced conversion. In essence, they would have the same status Christians had held under Muslim rule, dhimmi in reverse. on January 2nd, 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella entered Granada. Boabdil handed over the keys to the Alhambra. The last Muslim kingdom in Spain had fallen. The Reconquest that had begun, arguably, in 718 with the Battle of Covadonga, or which had accelerated in the 11th century with the fall of Toledo, or however you date such things, was complete. Spain was entirely under Christian political control. There's a famous legend about Boabdil's departure. As he left Granada for the last time, heading into exile in the Alpujarras Mountains, he stopped at a mountain pass and looked back at the city he had lost. He wept. His mother, Aixa, reportedly said to him, quote, 31. The pass is still called, quote, 32, quote, 33. The story is almost certainly apocryphal, created long after the events, but it captures something real about the emotional weight of that moment, the loss not just of a kingdom, but of an entire civilization's last foothold in Spain. The terms of the Treaty of Granada lasted barely a decade. By 1501, Cardinal Cisneros, the Archbishop of Toledo, and a powerful figure in the Catholic monarch's government, was actively working to force conversions. Muslim religious books were burned by the thousands, mosques were converted to churches or destroyed. The promise of religious freedom was broken. Muslims faced a choice: convert to Christianity or leave. Many converted, at least nominally. These converts, called Moriscos, remained suspect in Christian Spain. Always under surveillance, never quite trusted regardless of how outward their Christian practice appeared. The Moriscos would face increasing persecution over the following century, culminating in their total expulsion from Spain between 1609 and 1614. Others chose exile, making their way to North Africa, particularly to Morocco and Algeria, carrying with them memories of Al-Andalus that would be preserved in music, poetry, and stories for generations. The Jewish community of Granada, which had existed for centuries and had flourished particularly during the Nasrid period, faced an even more immediate crisis. The same year that Granada fell, in March 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra decree, also called the Edict of Expulsion, ordering all Jews to either convert to Christianity or leave Spain within 4 months. The Jewish community was given the same impossible choice being gradually imposed on Muslims. Thousands of Jews converted, becoming conversos, new Christians always under suspicion from the Inquisition. Tens of thousands more left, going to Portugal, from which they would be expelled a few years later, to Italy, to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa, to anywhere that would accept them. They carried with them a language, Ladino, a form of medieval Castilian Spanish, and a cultural identity as Sephardic Jews that would persist across centuries of diaspora. The irony that both expulsions were ordered from the Alhambra, a palace built by Muslims with Jewish advisors contributing to its creation, a building that embodied the multicultural achievement of Al-Andalus, was perhaps lost on Ferdinand and Isabella. Or perhaps it was deliberate symbolism, the new order literally replacing the old in the most visible, most beautiful monument to what had been. In October 1492, Christopher Columbus returned to Spain from his first voyage to what he believed was Asia, but was actually the Caribbean. Ferdinand and Isabella received him in Barcelona, learned of the lands he had encountered, the peoples he had met, the possibilities for wealth and conversion. Spain was turning westward, toward Atlantic Empire, toward becoming a global power. The attention and resources that had been devoted to the Reconquest could now be directed toward conquest in the New World. 1492 thus represents multiple transitions: the end of Al-Andalus, the expulsion of Jews, the beginning of Spanish colonialism in the Americas, the consolidation of Spain as a unified Catholic kingdom committed to religious uniformity. In a single year, medieval Spain became early modern Spain, and the world changed in ways that would reverberate for centuries. To understand what was lost when the Muslims and Jews were expelled from Spain, We need to look beyond the political and military narrative and consider the human and cultural dimensions. These weren't just population movements or religious transitions. They were the destruction of communities that had existed for centuries, the breaking of cultural traditions that had developed over generations, the dispersion of knowledge and skills that had made Spain a centre of learning and culture. The Muslim population that left or was forced to convert included scholars, physicians, artisans, merchants, farmers, people at every level of society. The agricultural knowledge developed over centuries, the irrigation systems maintained for generations, the crops and cultivation techniques that had transformed Spanish agriculture, much of this was lost or diminished. The Moriscos who stayed but converted couldn't practice their culture openly. The skills and knowledge passed down within Muslim communities began to erode. The Jewish expulsion was perhaps even more culturally devastating in certain respects. The Jewish communities of Spain had been deeply integrated into the economic and intellectual life of the kingdom. Jewish translators, physicians, financial administrators, merchants, scholars, their sudden absence left gaps that were difficult to fill. The conversos who stayed faced constant suspicion from the Inquisition. Any practice that seemed, quote, 34, lighting candles on Friday evening, avoiding pork, owning Hebrew books, could lead to investigation, imprisonment, even execution as a relapsed heretic. The Sephardic Jews who went into exile carried with them not just their religious traditions, but also their language and their memories of Spain. Ladino, the language they spoke, preserved a form of medieval Castilian Spanish that evolved separately from the Spanish spoken in Spain. Sephardic communities in places like Thessaloniki, Istanbul, Amsterdam maintained their distinct identity across centuries. They sang songs in Ladino, cooked foods from recipes brought from Spain, told stories about the land their ancestors had left. There's a deep melancholy in much of the Sephardic cultural tradition. A sense of loss and longing for a homeland that was no longer accessible, for a life that had been destroyed. Songs lament the expulsion, remember cities and homes left behind, express the pain of exile. This wasn't ancient history for these communities, but living memory passed down through generations. Grandparents telling grandchildren about what had been lost, keeping alive through stories and songs a connection to a place they could never return to. The intellectual loss was substantial. Al-Andalus had been Europe's entry point for classical knowledge preserved in Arabic. The tradition of translation and scholarship, the libraries and schools, the networks of scholars, all of this was disrupted. Some of it continued elsewhere, in the Ottoman Empire or in North Africa, but the particular configuration that had made Al-Andalus so productive was gone. Spain itself changed fundamentally. The commitment to religious uniformity, enforced through the Inquisition, created a culture of suspicion and conformity. Independent thought, particularly on religious matters, became dangerous. The intellectual openness that had characterized much of medieval Spain, the willingness to engage with ideas regardless of their origin, was replaced by a more rigid orthodoxy. Spain became increasingly isolated from the broader intellectual currents developing in Europe. There were economic consequences as well. The expelled Muslims and Jews had played important roles in commerce, manufacturing, and agriculture. Their absence created economic disruptions that took generations to overcome. The skills they had possessed, in metalwork, in textile production, in financial administration, had to be relearned or imported. The economic dynamism that had characterized medieval Spain diminished. But perhaps the most profound loss was cultural and intangible. The lived experience of Convivencia, imperfect as it had been, was replaced by uniformity. The rich cultural exchange that had occurred when Christians, Muslims, and Jews shared cities and streets, when they worked together and learned from each other, when they created new forms by mixing traditions, all of this became impossible. Spanish culture became more purely Christian, but also narrower, less complex, less rich in certain respects. The descendants of those expelled, both Muslim and Jewish, preserved memories of Al-Andalus that sometimes became idealized over time. In North African cities where refugees settled, in Sephardic communities scattered across the Mediterranean and beyond, Al-Andalus became a kind of paradise lost, a golden age of tolerance and learning that was destroyed by intolerance and religious absolutism. This memory, like all memories shaped by trauma and longing, wasn't entirely accurate. It often glossed over the inequalities and tensions that had existed, but it contained truth about what had been possible and what was lost. In Spain itself, the memory was more complicated. The buildings remained. The great Mosque of Córdoba, now a cathedral but still fundamentally the structure that Muslim architects had created. The Alhambra, preserved as a royal property. The Mudejar architecture and countless churches and palaces, the Arabic words embedded in the Spanish language, the agricultural landscapes shaped by Muslim irrigation. Physical reminders of the Islamic period were everywhere, even as the people and culture that created them were gone. For centuries, official Spanish culture downplayed or denigrated the Islamic period, treating it as an occupation that had finally been overcome rather than as an integral part of Spanish history. Only in recent decades has there been a more nuanced reckoning with this past, an attempt to acknowledge both the achievements and the complexities of Al-Andalus, to see it as part of Spanish heritage rather than alien to it. Despite the expulsions, despite the determined effort to create a purely Christian Spain, the influence of Al-Andalus on Spanish and European culture endured in ways both obvious and subtle. Some influences were material and visible, others were linguistic, musical, culinary, woven into daily life in ways that became so normalized that their origins were forgotten. The centuries of Islamic presence in Spain left marks that couldn't be entirely erased. The Spanish language itself carries hundreds of words derived from Arabic. Many begin with al, the Arabic definite article, alcohol, algebra, algorithm, alchemy, alcove. Others are less obviously Arabic, ojalá, from inshallah, if God wills, aceite, oil, aceituna, olive, naranja, orange, from naranj, limon, lemon, algodón, cotton, azúcar, sugar, arroz, rice. These words entered Spanish during the Al-Andalus period and remained, becoming part of the language even after the Arabic-speaking population was gone. The agricultural landscape of Spain, particularly in the south, still reflects Islamic influence. The irrigation systems, though many have been modernized, follow patterns established during the Al-Andalus period. The crops introduced then, citrus fruits, rice, sugar cane, many vegetables, remain staples of Spanish agriculture. The terraced hillsides, the distribution of water, the techniques of cultivation, all show continuity with practices developed centuries ago. Spanish music, and particularly the flamenco tradition, show Islamic influences, though tracing exact connections is complicated. The melismatic singing style, where a single syllable is stretched across multiple notes, the rhythmic structures, certain melodic patterns, all suggest connections to North African and Middle Eastern music. Whether flamenco directly descends from Andalusian musical traditions, or developed independently with influences from various sources including North African music brought by later contacts, it represents a musical aesthetic that feels related to the broader Mediterranean and Middle Eastern musical world. The intellectual influence extended far beyond Spain. The translations of Arabic works into Latin that had occurred in places like Toledo in the 12th and 13th centuries, the transmission of Greek philosophy and science through Arabic intermediaries shaped European thought profoundly. The universities of Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and other centres of learning in the 13th and 14th centuries were teaching from texts that had been preserved and transmitted through the Islamic world, and often through Al-Andalus specifically. European astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy in the late medieval and early modern periods all built on foundations that included Islamic contributions. The very idea of the university as an institution for higher learning, while it developed its specific European form in places like Bologna and Paris, was influenced by models of organized scholarly institutions in the Islamic world. The emphasis on systematic study of texts, on commentary and debate, on the integration of different fields of knowledge, reflected practices that Islamic scholars had developed. The architectural influence is visible across Spain and even beyond. The Mudajar style, using Islamic architectural elements in Christian buildings, became distinctively Spanish. Churches with horseshoe arches, palaces with geometric tilework and wooden ceilings in the Andalusian style, towers that echo minaret designs, these appear throughout Spain, a fusion that acknowledged, even if unconsciously, that Islamic architecture had created forms of great beauty worth incorporating into Christian building. The ideal of Convivencia, even though it was destroyed in practice, survived as an idea, a possibility that had existed and might exist again. In later centuries, when Europe struggled with questions of religious tolerance, of how different faiths might coexist, the example of Al-Andalus, often idealized, simplified, stripped of its complexities, served as a reference point. The fact that Christians, Muslims and Jews had lived together for centuries in medieval Spain, had created remarkable culture together, suggested that such coexistence was possible even if difficult. The scholarly tradition of Al-Andalus influenced European science and philosophy in specific traceable ways. The empirical approach to medicine, the careful observation and recording of astronomical phenomena, the emphasis on mathematical precision in understanding the physical world, the integration of ancient Greek thought with contemporary investigation, all of these practices that would be central to the development of modern science had been developed and refined in the Islamic world, including Al-Andalus. The influence on literature is harder to trace, but real nonetheless. The troubadour tradition of medieval southern France, the development of courtly love poetry in Christian Europe, the Romance tradition, all show possible influences from Andalusian Arabic and Hebrew poetry. The exact mechanisms of transmission are debated, but the parallels are striking enough to suggest cultural exchange, ideas and forms moving across the permeable frontier between Christian and Muslim Spain and then northward into wider Europe. Perhaps most importantly, the physical reminders remained. The great Mosque of Córdoba, though converted into a cathedral, still existed as a building, its forest of columns and striped arches testament to what Muslim architects had achieved. The Alhambra, preserved despite the change in rulership, stood as perhaps the most beautiful building medieval Europe had produced. These weren't just historical curiosities, but demonstrations that Islamic culture in Spain had created works of enduring value and beauty. In the 19th century, when European Romanticism discovered the Alhambra, when Washington Irving wrote Quote 39 when artists painted the decaying but still beautiful palace, Al-Andalus entered European consciousness in a new way, not as enemy or other, but as a fascinating lost civilization whose achievements commanded respect and admiration. This romantic rediscovery wasn't historically accurate in many respects, but it did acknowledge that something of value had existed and been lost. The concept of convivencia, the coexistence of Christians, Muslims and Jews in medieval Spain, has been debated, idealized, and contested by historians, politicians and cultural commentators for decades. Understanding what it actually meant, separating the historical reality from later mythologies and projections, is essential to honestly assessing the Al-Andalus legacy. The Romantic view, popular in some circles, portrays Al-Andalus as a kind of paradise of tolerance, a multicultural utopia where the three faiths lived in perfect harmony, collaborating on scholarly projects and creating great culture together without conflict or inequality. This version is appealing, particularly in our contemporary world where religious conflict remains so common and destructive. It suggests that a better way is possible, that people of different faiths can coexist peacefully and even enrich each other. The counter-narrative, often promoted by those skeptical of romanticizing Islamic rule, emphasizes the inequalities inherent in the dhimmi system, the episodes of violence and persecution, the fact that non-Muslims always had inferior legal status under Islamic law, that the tolerance extended was pragmatic and limited rather than principled and generous. This view sees Convivencia as more myth than reality, a later invention that doesn't match the historical record. The truth, as it usually does, lies somewhere between these extremes and is more complex than either simplified version allows. Al-Andalus was not a paradise of perfect tolerance. There was a clear hierarchy with Muslims at the top, enjoying privileges that Christians and Jews didn't have. Non-Muslims paid special taxes, faced restrictions on religious practice and display, couldn't serve in certain government positions, and could face violence during periods of religious fervour or political instability. At the same time, the system did allow for substantial religious and cultural pluralism. Christians and Jews could practice their faiths, maintain their own institutions, govern their internal affairs according to their own laws, own property, engage in commerce, participate in intellectual life. This wasn't equality, but it was a form of coexistence that allowed minority communities not just to survive, but in many cases to flourish. Compared to the treatment of religious minorities in much of medieval Europe, where Jews faced periodic expulsions and massacres, and where Islam was considered a heresy to be fought, the Andalusian system was relatively tolerant. The cultural exchange that occurred was real and substantial. Scholars of different faiths did work together, translating texts, discussing philosophy, advancing medical knowledge. This collaboration wasn't always driven by noble ideals of mutual understanding. Sometimes it was simple professional necessity or economic advantage, but it happened nonetheless and produced remarkable results. The synthesis of Greek, Islamic, Jewish, and Christian thought that occurred in Al-Andalus shaped European intellectual history in profound ways. The system varied significantly across time and place. The early Umayyad Emirate and Caliphate in the 9th and 10th centuries was generally more tolerant than the Almohad period in the 12th century. Córdoba at its peak offered more opportunities for interfaith interaction than a small frontier town might have. The Taifa period saw both intense cultural flowering and increased political instability. There wasn't one consistent Al-Andalus experience, but rather a complex changing reality that unfolded over 8 centuries. The concept of convivencia, as it's often discussed today, is partly a modern construction. The term itself, while Spanish, wasn't used in medieval sources the way it's used now. The idea of convivencia as a distinct Spanish historical phenomenon was largely developed by the 20th century Spanish historian Americo Castro, who argued that the interaction of the three faiths was the defining feature of medieval Spanish culture. His work sparked decades of debate about how to interpret this period. Some of the appeal of the convivencia narrative today is understandable. We're searching for historical models of religious coexistence in a world where such coexistence often seems impossible. Finding a period when it worked, even imperfectly, is encouraging. It suggests that the conflicts we see aren't inevitable, that humans have managed to live together across religious difference before and might do so again. But we should be careful not to impose our contemporary values and concerns onto the medieval past. The people of Al-Andalus weren't trying to create a multicultural society in the modern sense. Muslims believed their faith was true and superior. Christians believed the same about Christianity, Jews about Judaism. The tolerance extended wasn't based on modern ideas of religious relativism or pluralism, but on practical necessity, legal frameworks inherited from earlier periods, and sometimes genuine intellectual curiosity about other traditions. The system worked when it worked because of practical factors, economic interdependence, legal structures that provided clear roles and expectations, the presence of powerful rulers who enforced order and prevented factional violence, and probably an element of habit. People who had lived together for generations developed ways of negotiating difference that became customary. When those factors weakened or disappeared, convivencia broke down. What we can say with confidence is that for significant periods in medieval Spain, Christians, Muslims and Jews did live together in the same cities and kingdoms, did interact in markets and courts and scholarly settings, did create remarkable culture that drew on all three traditions. and did so in ways that were unusual by the standards of medieval Europe. This coexistence was real, even if imperfect, unequal, and sometimes tense. The value of studying this period isn't to find a perfect model to replicate. We can't recreate medieval social structures, nor should we want to replicate their inequalities, but to see that sustained coexistence across religious difference is possible under the right conditions, that such coexistence can produce remarkable cultural achievements, and also to understand the factors that allow it to work or cause it to fail. Al-Andalus ultimately failed to survive, ended in expulsion and forced conversion, in the destruction of the multicultural society that had existed. That failure is part of the story too, a reminder that tolerance is fragile, that political and religious pressures can overwhelm traditions of coexistence, that what seems stable for centuries can collapse relatively quickly when circumstances change. 800 years after the fall of Granada, the question of what Al-Andalus means, what lessons it offers, what its legacy signifies, remains contested and complex. Different groups claim different meanings, project different values onto those medieval centuries, use the memory of Al-Andalus to support various contemporary arguments about identity, religion, tolerance, and culture. In Spain itself, the relationship to this past has evolved significantly. For much of the Franco dictatorship period, the Islamic period was minimized or treated as an occupation that had finally been overcome. Spanish identity was defined in opposition to this past rather than as including it. The narrative was of Christian Spain finally restored after centuries of Islamic rule, the Reconquista as a glorious triumph. This interpretation served Franco's particular vision of a pure, Catholic, unified Spain. In recent decades, particularly since Spain's transition to democracy, there's been a more nuanced reckoning. Scholars, artists, and cultural institutions have explored the Al-Andalus period with more complexity, acknowledging both its achievements and its problems, seeing it as an integral part of Spanish history rather than an alien interruption. The physical heritage, the Alhambra, the Mezquita of Córdoba, the Mudéjar architecture scattered across Spain, has been preserved and celebrated as part of Spain's cultural patrimony. Tourism has played a role in this shift. The Alhambra is one of Spain's most visited sites, attracting millions of tourists annually. The economic value of this cultural heritage has encouraged its preservation and celebration. But there's also been genuine scholarly and cultural interest in understanding this period more fully, in appreciating its contributions to Spanish and European culture. In the Islamic world, Al-Andalus occupies a particular place in cultural memory. It's often remembered as a golden age, a period when Islamic civilization in the West reached extraordinary heights of achievement in learning, arts, and culture. The loss of Al-Andalus is mourned as a tragedy, the expulsion of the Muslims remembered with pain. The Alhambra and the Mezquita appear frequently in Islamic art and literature as symbols of what was achieved and what was lost. This memory has sometimes been idealized, the difficulties and complexities smoothed away to create a narrative of unalloyed success followed by unjust destruction. But it contains truth about real achievement, about a time when Islamic culture in Europe created works of enduring beauty and value. For Muslims living in contemporary Europe, many of whom face discrimination and questions about whether they truly belong, the history of Al-Andalus demonstrates that Muslims have been part of European history for over a millennium, that Islamic culture has contributed substantially to European civilization. For Jewish communities, particularly Sephardic Jews, Al-Andalus is remembered as a time of flourishing despite minority status, a period when Jewish culture achieved remarkable heights in philosophy, poetry, and scholarship. Figures like Maimonides represent the possibility of intellectual synthesis, of being deeply Jewish while also engaging with the wider philosophical and scientific traditions. The expulsion from Spain remains a trauma in Sephardic cultural memory, but the memory of what existed before expulsion is also preserved and honoured. The broader question of what Al-Andalus means for contemporary discussions of religious coexistence and multiculturalism is complicated and contested. Some see it as evidence that religious pluralism is possible and beneficial, that societies which embrace diversity can achieve remarkable things. They point to the cultural achievements, the intellectual flowering that occurred precisely because of the mixing of traditions, and argue that this demonstrates the value of tolerance and exchange. Others are sceptical of drawing contemporary lessons from such a different historical context. The medieval world operated on fundamentally different assumptions than ours, about religion, politics, hierarchy, and human rights. The dhimmi system, however relatively tolerant by medieval standards, was still based on inequality that we would find unacceptable today. Trying to apply lessons from this period to contemporary multicultural societies may be comparing incomparable situations. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Al-Andalus demonstrates both possibilities and limitations. It shows that sustained coexistence across religious difference is possible, that such coexistence can produce cultural achievement, that intellectual exchange between traditions can be mutually enriching. It also shows that such coexistence is fragile, that it depends on specific conditions and careful maintenance, that political pressures can destroy it, that tolerance is not a natural or inevitable state, but an achievement that requires constant work. The enduring fascination with Al-Andalus, the books written about it, the music inspired by it, the artistic works that draw on its imagery, the scholarly conferences devoted to studying it, suggest that it touches something important in contemporary consciousness. In a world struggling with questions of religious conflict, immigration, cultural identity, and the possibilities of pluralism, the example of medieval Spain, however imperfect and however distant, offers both hope and warning. The physical remains endure, perhaps the most powerful legacy. The Alhambra still stands on its hill above Granada, still beautiful, still capable of inspiring awe. The great Mosque of Córdoba, though now a cathedral, still contains within its Christian additions the original Islamic structure. Walking through these spaces, you can still feel something of what was created there. The attention to beauty, the mathematical sophistication, the integration of the spiritual and aesthetic, the sense that the physical environment can elevate human experience. These buildings survived when the culture that created them was destroyed. They testify to the possibility of creating beauty that transcends the circumstances of its creation, that speaks to people of different times, different faiths, different cultures. They remind us that what humans create at their best, in art, architecture, music, poetry, philosophy, can outlast empires and outlive the conflicts that dominated their time. Al-Andalus is gone. The specific configuration of medieval Spanish culture, the particular mix of Islamic political authority with Christian and Jewish participation, the intellectual climate that valued knowledge from any source, the architectural traditions that created such beauty, all of that ended in 1492 and cannot be recovered or recreated. But the memory endures, the physical evidence remains, the influences continue to shape Spanish and European culture, and the questions raised about how different peoples and faiths might live together remain urgently relevant. Perhaps that's the most we can ask of history, not perfect models to replicate, not simple lessons to apply, but honest examples to study, to understand in their complexity, to draw what wisdom we can while acknowledging what we cannot know or cannot replicate. Al-Andalus was remarkable and flawed, brilliant and unequal, creative and ultimately fragile. It was a human achievement, with all the glory and limitation that implies. We've travelled together now for 2.5 hours through 8 centuries of Spanish history, through the rise and fall of a civilization that existed at the crossroads of Christian, Muslim and Jewish worlds, through the streets of Córdoba and the halls of the Alhambra, through gardens and libraries and marketplaces where people of different faiths shared space and sometimes understanding. From the crossing at Gibraltar in 711 to the surrender of Granada in 1492, we've followed the arc of Al-Andalus, how it began in conquest, how it grew into a centre of learning and culture, how it created beauty and knowledge that would influence the world far beyond its borders, and how it finally fell, ending in expulsion and forced conversion. We've met philosophers and poets, physicians and architects, sultans and scholars, ordinary people navigating the complexities of living together across difference. The answer to the question we might ask, what was Al-Andalus really? Was it a paradise of tolerance or a hierarchical society that merely permitted diversity? The answer, as honestly as I can give it, is both and neither. It was a complex human society that lasted for centuries, that changed dramatically over time, that created remarkable achievements while maintaining significant inequalities, that demonstrated possibilities for coexistence while ultimately failing to sustain them. It was, like all of history, more complicated and more human than any simple narrative can capture. If you enjoyed this slow drift through medieval Spain, this exploration of what it meant when three faiths shared one land, a like and subscribe really helps. It allows more people to find these peaceful journeys through history. And please, if you have thoughts, questions, reflections on what we've explored tonight, share them in the comments. I learn from your perspectives and insights. To those who've been with me before on other journeys, thank you for returning. Your presence in this community matters. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whether in Spain contemplating these physical remnants of this history, or far from there but connected by curiosity to this past, I hope you're comfortable. I hope the questions this story raises feel like interesting puzzles rather than troubling burdens. I hope your breathing has slowed, that your thoughts have quieted, that your body feels heavy and warm, ready for rest. Look up at the stars if you can see them. If you have a window nearby, those are the same stars that Averroes studied through his instruments, that Alfonso X's astronomers catalogued in their tables, that countless people in medieval Spain looked up at from the courtyards of the Alhambra, or the streets of Córdoba, or the countryside of Andalusia. Those stars have outlasted empires, outlasted the conflicts that seemed so urgent to the people living through them, outlasted everything except the human need to look up and wonder. All those cities we've visited tonight, Córdoba in its glory, Granada in its final years, Toledo as it changed hands, they still exist, though transformed by centuries. The Guadalquivir still flows past where the great mosque stands. The Sierra Nevada still rises behind the Alhambra. The land endures even when the political systems and cultures that occupied it change. There's something comforting in that continuity, in the knowledge that the physical world continues regardless of human political arrangements, that beauty can survive destruction, that what's truly valuable finds ways to persist. Perhaps the final thought to carry into sleep is this: that human beings are capable of creating extraordinary beauty and profound ugliness, sometimes simultaneously, that we can build societies of remarkable achievement while maintaining troubling inequalities, that we can live together across deep differences, but that such coexistence is always fragile, always requiring conscious effort and favourable circumstances. Al-Andalus demonstrated all of this. It's a reminder of both human possibility and human limitation, both what we might achieve and how easily it can be lost. Sleep well. Dream, if you will, of courtyards with fountains, of the sound of water flowing through ancient channels, of horseshoe arches and geometric patterns that continue endlessly, of gardens where three traditions planted trees that still bear fruit. Dream of light filtering through carved screens, creating patterns that shift with the sun's movement, of poetry carved into walls, of scholars bent over manuscripts by lamplight, of all the quiet moments of beauty and understanding that existed amid the conflicts and changes. Dream of what endures when everything else falls away, the human capacity for creating beauty, for seeking truth, for occasionally, imperfectly, learning to live together. Good night. Rest well in the knowledge that history continues, that the questions don't end but evolve, that what we learn from the past informs how we navigate the present and imagine the future. May your rest be deep and peaceful, your dreams gentle, your morning bright. Good night.